whom you all know, and the fellows of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Let me welcome you all to this roundtable discussion on lessons from Korea and whether or not there's anything that South Africa can derive from these lessons for development. I'm delighted and indeed honored by the panel we've been able to assemble for the occasion. Some esteemed guests. And I'll introduce them shortly, but I thought I would start just to frame the discussion with this brief presentation. And just to sort of give you a bit of context, this, what we've been projecting, as you've been coming in, is from 1956, classic bit of Korean cinema called Madame Freedom. Are you familiar with this film? Yeah. Now, Madame Freedom, it is a classic bit of Korean cinema, but this isn't a talk on cinema, but I thought it's a very interesting way to begin the conversation because it's set in Seoul in 1956, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, when Korea is one of the world's poorest countries. And the film was made to dramatize what was seen as being the loss of culture that came as a result of modernization. But it is astonishing to think, when you look at the scenes of Seoul in 1956, to think of what it would mean to see cultural change, because in just 60 years, we went from that to this situation. How do I get this to play? And this is Korea today. This is Seoul today. I mean, it's from its media travel thing. So, and it is just dramatic, the change. I mean, everything about it, the way people dress, as Professor Pansel was saying to me before this began, the shopping is terrific, and the shopping is terrific, the food is great. It's an incredibly prosperous society. But the other thing that is striking about Seoul, for anybody who's visited it, if you just think of that image of Seoul in 1956 and Seoul today, is that this is a city which has grown as fast as any city in the world has grown. But where we normally associate development and growth and urbanization that is this rapid with informal settlement and urban sprawl, it's extraordinarily difficult, as we all know, to actually manage the growth of a city. It's an incredibly well-organized city. It's just mind-boggling just about anybody to wonder how they did this. And this is the great question. Korea is really, one can make the case, is South Korea specifically, because the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that although we think of South Korea as rich and North Korea as poor, in the 1950s it was the reverse. North Korea was the country that, right through the 1970s, was the more prosperous of the two. The Korean miracle, as we call it, really begins only in the 1960s, and as anybody who lived through the period, any of the Koreans here can tell you, it wasn't really something that in your day-to-day life you start to feel in a significant way until the 1970s. Professor Dan Kim was once telling me about how in his village there was one color television at this time that they would assemble to watch football games on. So today, of course, it is one of the world's most prosperous societies, of course, technologically very dynamic. And the question is, what have they done? And everybody's trying to say, well, what can we learn? Well, what are the, oops, wrong way. I mean, just to dramatize the contrast, in 1960, of course, Korea has a lower per capita income than South Africa, and then begins its rapid ascent, which doesn't look rapid at the time because it's starting from such a low base. Bear in mind, what was the per capita income in 1960? Ambassador, I believe it was $72? $67 per capita income. Substantially less prosperous than South Africa. And since then, well, the rest is history. This isn't done to make South Africa look bad. Just about any country in the world set against South Korea doesn't look particularly good. So the question is, what accounts for this dramatic takeoff, and can the model be replicated? What's not working? Oh, here we go. So what are the various explanations? Well, we have the standard neoclassical model, which essentially attributes this. What am I calling it? Okay. So basically, the standard neoclassical economic model says this commitment to private property rights, market getting the price right. This is a key one. That there wasn't distortion of market signals. So investment was allocated in a rational manner, consumption decisions were equally made in a rational manner, and this supported a thriving entrepreneurial economy very significantly. And this is perhaps the one element of the neoclassical model that critics of the neoclassical model would agree with: wage repression, which, again, the average Korean would not have noticed in their daily pay packet much change until at least the 1970s. They could notice the changes occurring around them, though, because the rate of investment was very high in South Korea, owing to the fact that the surpluses generated as a result of wage repression permitted a very high rate of reinvestment, both public reinvestment and corporate reinvestment. Another significant thing we can't sort of overlook was the role of land redistribution, that Korea had what would by most standards be considered a rather radical program of land redistribution in the late 1940s, wasn't it, that it happened, which created, and this is a point that the ambassador speaks about in the book, his book, which I will mention shortly. This created not only a mass market when consumption would rise in South Korea, it also created an egalitarian society, which gave it a strong sense of buy-in. And of course, in many ways, we might want to look to the Korean model of land redistribution as a possible lesson for South Africa. In others, some might say, well, it's a bit late, that in the time of land redistribution in Korea, 75% of the population lived on the land. In South Africa today, it is, of course, a much lower population living on the land, and it is a primarily urbanized society, and perhaps redistribution would have to take a different form. Now, the neoclassical model, it has to be said, hasn't enjoyed very wide reception outside of neoclassical circles, which of course remain dominant. But the simple fact is that most Korean scholars who look at this, I think it's safe to say, correct me if I'm wrong, would say it simply doesn't capture all the elements that went into making it successful, and instead there has been the emergence of this idea of the Asian model, or sometimes called the developmental state, which often comes up in discussions here in South Africa and has been doing so for the last quarter century. Now, what are the elements of the developmental state? Well, first of all, there's a protection, so the notion of a liberalized trading regime is really misleading, because in fact, selected industries are nurtured and protected, and actually, I should say, the two. It's not just that they're protected from import competition, but they're actually subsidized. But significantly, this is not import substitution, because it was not protection right across the whole industrial sector. It was those industries, those firms, which were seen to be to have growth potential within the context of what structuralist economists call dynamic comparative advantage. So that involves use of export subsidies, cheap state credit. This is critical. So if anything, there's and the use of export targets with rewards for firms that met the performance standards, nurturing new subsectors. So it was very much a sort of bureaucratic, hands-on, what are the areas in which we need to train the human capital to fit investing in education that serves those needs. So it's not a liberalized education market where you let the students choose. It's very much steering in the direction that's going to serve national development. The use of capital and price controls, particularly international capital, so that you prevent any kind of capital flight taking place. All of this, incidentally, putting paid to the notion of getting the prices right. As some people say, they deliberately got the prices wrong in order to encourage certain industries. Limiting new entrants to reduce competition, this is key. So it's not actually a competitive market for much of this developmental period. Government gets the price wrong, and this raises a critical question then, this is an important thing. The period in which the takeoff occurs is post-1962, which is of course 62 is the year of the coup, isn't it? And the end of democracy, at least for a protracted period. And this is perhaps one of the, if not the greatest debate, one of the great debates in Korea to this day, and I think one of the main political polarizations is, was it necessary to have an authoritarian regime to do all this? Because the simple fact is, in many societies, when we talk about developmental states, we sort of combine it with a democratic or participatory notion. Well, let's get people together. I can remember in one country where I was running a think tank in a developing country, and the government said, we're going to get everybody, all the stakeholders together, we're going to have a big weekend-long consultation, and we'll set up our priorities. And I said, well, that's not the developmental state, because the developmental state doesn't ask people what they want to do. It is actually planning 50 or 60 years down the road and telling people what they're going to get, in effect. And this, of course, highlights the role of an elite and technocratic bureaucracy. As I say, planning a city that grows that fast takes an immense capacity, bureaucratic capacity. Is it, and then also, this is very significant and worth mentioning and worth stressing, is that a key role of the government in this was to shelter the bureaucracy from political meddling. So it would be, in many ways, the exact reverse of state capture, although curiously, one could say it wasn't, in some ways, it was a form of state capture because that allowed very close bonds to build between the bureaucratic elite and the corporate elite, who therefore were involved in influencing decisions, but didn't actually control decisions. There was a great deal of autonomy, at least this is what the proponents of the developmental state say. Key thing, picking winners. Everybody likes the idea of picking winners. Everywhere I go, you hear governments and talking about we're going to have an industrial policy that picks winners. And what they overlook is that the success of the Korean model depended heavily on picking losers as well. It meant a preparedness not only to allow the firms that weren't seen to be competitive to go to the wall, but to actually encourage that process, to accelerate it. As I say, get the prices wrong, reward the winners, and this is something I know the ambassador himself has some very strong views on, but also, in a sense, punish the losers, free out those resources to accelerate the process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, if you will. And the insulation from political interference I mentioned. And this raises a very, very thorny question, which is it possible, and some argue that this model can work in democratic societies, but there is a body of thought that says, A, the time has passed, and B, it's simply not possible in a democratic system because it involves taking decisions that will be very unpopular, at least over the long term, at least over the short term. Now, this is the ambassador's book, which is just coming this year, and I draw your attention to because to some extent I wanted to frame the discussion we had this evening. And in the ambassador, whom I will introduce to you shortly, has a long history in Africa. In many ways, he comes in and he's making some provocative arguments, certainly to a South African audience, or certainly I think to any African audience, about saying what lessons can be taken from the Korean model. That perhaps we've been taking the wrong lessons, but that isn't to say there aren't lessons to be taken. And I think one of the things which has made me at least willing to hear him out, in a sense, even though he's sort of making what some would say are very provocative arguments, is his long history of involvement in Africa that goes all the way back to his teen years. And he is both a scholar and a diplomat. So, but I will let you know that his diplomacy doesn't mean he won't sort of engage in the proper debate. He makes an interesting argument, which I think is worth at least considering. And it's interesting because his argument is that mindset is vital to an understanding of the Korean experience. But I think this is a significant point, because this gets us into the area most of us in development are a bit uncomfortable with, is the whole question of culture and development. Are some cultures more prone to development, others are not? And it's a rather nuanced argument, which is that mindset is something which actually changes. And to that extent, and he mentions at some length in the book, the Canaan Farmers School. And you'll be hearing a lot about the Canaan Farmers School, because this was my visit to the Canaan Farmers School, and you will recognize me on the right and the chap on the left will be introduced to you shortly, who is actually the grandson of the founder of this school, which has a very interesting history. And I think rather than telling you about the history, I'm going to let the participants. But the ambassador's argument, and it is not only his argument, it's one that one comes across in Korea, is that the school itself didn't transform on its own Korean society, but it started a movement. And it's quite a dramatic, I will simply say very quickly, essentially the principle of the school is to train people to be farmers, but fundamentally it's to train them into, in a sense, into a very much a collective spirit, the kind of collective spirit of sacrifice. So that today, if I'm not mistaken, Alexander, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, which I usually am, as my mother will describe. The interesting thing is that both government officials and corporate executives have sometimes spent time in this school. What time do they have to get up in the morning to begin? At 5 in the morning, they get up, they eat a simple breakfast, they're out in the field. So you can imagine the way in which this would change mindset. And interestingly, some experiments are being conducted in other African countries with this school. As I say, I won't talk any further about this because I'll let the experts. Let me now just sort of introduce our panel to you. As I was saying, Ambassador Jung Dae Park, would you like to come up and join us? And Ambassador, you can sit in one of the chairs, who I've just introduced, has, as I say, a long history in Africa, both as a diplomat and as a scholar. Has done his doctorate in the field, and so he brings that very interesting length of experience and depth of experience to this particular discussion. Professor Jang Sang Kim, a visiting scholar from the University from Yonsei University in Korea, professor of development studies. Interestingly, very interesting background because he didn't start in development studies. Mongani would be interested. He began as actually as a theologian, became a philosopher. And he's what we would call a Renaissance man. Has ended up, much as he set out not to ever be involved in development studies, given that he grew up in development studies, he's ended up fulfilling the family or keeping the family tradition. So why don't you join us? And finally, I want to, Professor Samantha Ashman, who is supposed to join us, is not yet here, but if she does show up, I'll ask if not. And Busani Nswena, I'm sorry I've mangled your name. I'm still working on my Zulu pronunciation. It's a terrible European accent, but he is the director, the head of policy in the presidency. What is it? Comfortable chairs. They're much nicer. Head of policy in the presidency. And also actually very long distinguished career in the public sector. He has been, if I'm not mistaken, the chief of staff to 4 deputy presidents, am I correct about that? As well as an academic in his own right, so he brings a very interesting inside perspective. So we're going to just have a fairly informal discussion, and I will then gradually throw the floor over to questions. But I thought it would be nice just to start, and we have a microphone, although I don't think we would probably need the microphone for the time being, because I think everyone can hear. If you don't hear it back, let us know. And I guess the question I would ask each of you is, what, if any, insights can South Africa take, and Africa more generally, from the Korean model? And is it applicable? Or are the differences so great that simply something that we can't bring? Ambassador, because you've just written this book, I'll start with you. And while the others think about this very bit of a trap question. Yeah, could you tell, and perhaps you might take a minute to just explain a bit more about your concept of mindset and how perhaps mindset you feel was actually changed in Korea. In other words, that it wasn't a cultural endowment that destined Korea to greatness, it was actually a deliberate change to change the way the citizenry thought.
Thank you very much, Professor Rapley. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you everyone for coming, especially His Excellency Tekle Mariam, Ambassador of Ethiopia. So, and I'm very lucky to have Professor Kim Jang-sang come to South Africa. I met him in Uganda. It's about 7 or 8 years ago, and I first came to Africa in 1973 as a teenager, and then came back as a diplomat. So I took advantage of my destiny of living here, growing up here, and also working as a diplomat. So now I would like to talk more as a kind of a semi-scholar, because I don't want to be a diplomat saying things about development. I think Your Excellency understands, so you should bear with me on that. And coming to Uganda in 2011, and before coming to Uganda as head of the mission, actually I was charged. I heard about the Ghana school farming, And everybody was saying, including in Koikan, that if you're going to Uganda, you must visit Ghana School of Farming first, and meet the principal and Professor Kim Jang-seng. So I got oriented in that mindset change program of Korea in 2011, and went to Uganda. And most of the work in Uganda was development cooperation. Unlike South Africa. South Africa is a middle income country, so there's not much development assistance going on. It's more of a public diplomacy. So over the years, I was heavily involved with development assistance, working with Koika, development partners, international organizations, and Professor Kim Jang-seng came on a regular basis. And I found that what was essential for development, and I had a question, so many questions. Why Africa with so much potential and very favorable conditions would have challenges? So the questions came, and that's how I came to write the book. So in a sense, nutshell, I think Africa's challenges is not about resources or means. I think it's more about the question of management. And the management comes from the mindset and the confidence that people can do it. And I think one of the most powerful lessons that we can draw from Korea is that we've shown the world that people can have confidence and the commitment and the will to achieve, despite the odds of not having virtually any of the resources that most of developing countries in Africa enjoys. A very adverse state, poverty, coming out of civil war, and the lack of resources, and the lack of arable land, all those negative things. So I think Korea can be very much relevant, and it's not a question of how countries are different. I think in economic development, the principle that applies are the same. People think because of different history, different culture, geography, that things should be different. But when you go into a nutshell, fundamentals are all the same. Yes.
Can I ask a sort of a provocative question, and then I'll get to the examine to give this into that. But two questions actually. One is, I know we've had discussions, you and I, and you happen to think that the developmental state model isn't really properly understood in South Africa. That they pick the elements that they like and not the elements they dislike, and perhaps you could comment about that. The other thing is, in terms of mindset, what have been your observations so far in South Africa where you think that the mindset would need to change in order to bring about the kind of transformation you would argue happens? So,
yeah, so pick on the last question first. People think changing a mindset is the most difficult thing. And people can easily give up, even trying. But it's very, very much possible. And in the book, I write about how to achieve that kind of mindset change. It is not just all of a sudden adapting, a very alien, system of thoughts. Rather, for developing countries, it is reviving what is traditional, which I think is communal spirit, which every country has. Because many African countries has been exposed after the independence to modernity and the free trade, free international economy. They think they have to jump and join immediately the international trend or system. But the process is to begin from their own tradition. And why Korea was able to transform so quickly before being independent and before the Korean War, we were also a very traditional society. Although we had a long history of bureaucracy and so on, we were that much backwards in terms of development. And it was not much different than many other poor countries during that time. But I think why we were able to successfully transform is not because we just adapted immediately the system, the Western modes, or Western economic system and the institution, everything. But we were able to use a medium, kind of a stepping stone, that I call the so-called medium in my book, which is actually social capital intensive. So traditional sector is a labor intensive, right? And modern sector is a capital intensive. But you cannot just go from the former to the latter all of a sudden. So the law of John Lewis's model of dual economy does not apply to many developed countries. You cannot just have population move from rural areas to urban areas and you expect them to be productive and absorb into the manufacturing sector. There has to be some process. Western countries did that over 100, 200 years. How can we do it all of a sudden from non-Western Oriental society to modern society? But the thing is that we discovered our tradition of communal movement. And in Africa, there are so many of them. Rwanda is one of the successful cases with governance these days, as well as Ethiopia is doing a lot. They have their own tradition of self-help through using the social capital. So in Rwanda, they call it umuganda. In Uganda, they call it Rijikwansi. And South Africa, you can say it's Ubuntu. It's a self-help, community movement that is productive. But somehow, with the independence, westernization, many African countries have forgotten their tradition. So that's why they are at a loss of adapting to the two different worlds. So, Samoan movement and Ghana's school of farming teaches to be very productive, independent, and community, minded, community oriented.
Can I ask Lusani maybe to come into this point? Because one of the sort of challenges that South Africa faces in society of extraordinarily rapid change in terms of urbanization. In terms of, I hear, speaking to older South Africans, that the respect for elders is diminished dramatically. Although Koreans will say the same thing. A highly inegalitarian society with the economic structure, which is highly dualistic in a sense. Is it even, do you think, reasonable to talk about a collective enterprise like this, or do we have too many obstacles to overcome before we can even think? And is it even something that would be worth considering?
Thanks. Well, so a few bullet points. One, the manifestations of modernity and colonial encounters in South Korea differ significantly from those manifestations here in South Africa. The extent to which modernity and colonial encounters disrupted those historical traditional modes of engaging, of working together, disrupted as differently in South Africa than in South Korea and many other parts of the world. But then in the 60s, when Korea becomes independent, there is a contradiction here. There's a funny thing about South Africa that we talk about us embracing our history in total. It also means that we embrace the fact that our South African Air Force is one of the longest, oldest Air Forces in the world, and we celebrate that it fought in the Korean War on the side of South Korea. But here in South Africa, the very same Air Force was actually striving division and providing air support to a system that was brutalizing the majority. But if we do go to Korea, if we meet a Korean ambassador and we want to celebrate, how cordial we are, we will talk about that contradiction, which is but then that's who we are. And in that context of these, contradictions, a few things emerge, including the extent to which modernity and the impact and permeated our value system to a point where today there's something, there's this phenomenon here which didn't exist in the case when we're taking off, which is the issue of trust deficit. There's so much trust deficit because the system built it as part, is embedded in our DNA, that it's very difficult that the citizens could give to the state the right to make, the citizens here can't just make the right to give the state the right to make certain decisions, believing that those will be, in the benefits of the state. And remember, some of the laws that we have today were done even with the Mandela in mind, that the idea was that you must hold the states accountable and so on. And you'll remember that in 1994, when the South African democratic state emerged globally, we had a different balance of forces. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and therefore our ability to maneuver and make certain decisions was circumscribed compared to the period in the 60s when Korea was taking off. In fact, even I was talking to one Kenyan scholar who was talking about South Africa and the missed opportunities, and I wanted to remind you that in fact at the time at which US Kenya became free, including South Korea, and were investing in education and so on, there's a time at which South Africans were going in exile, they were saying free man. There's a time at which Mandela got into prison, and you go and spend another 27 years trying to free Mandela, another 4 years trying to negotiate, and then you begin to forge a new modernity that is inclusive and so on. So we have to look at the total experience and the fact that we will always have that deficit of 27 years if we compare with Kenya plus other time. And remember, we came into being when Mandela and Reagan changed completely the global balance of forces, and in particular the global terms of trade. Right? So you could have export-led industrialization. We came into being when there was WTO and so on, and what they were pushing was liberalization. So when you were closing and protecting the industries, we were liberalizing on the other hand, because the global balance of forces was such that in South Africa, we couldn't go that direction. And lastly, we also been in Uganda of Ethiopia here. I mean, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, and so forth. If they were in Europe, they will set the price of coffee, but they don't set the price of coffee. It is set elsewhere, precisely because the global missions of power have determined that the price of coffee will be set elsewhere, and not in this country that setting the price of coffee. So when you talk about development, there is a disruption that is required, even amongst these global trading system, that constrain the ability of Ethiopia, that has the best coffee, from its ability to be able to set the price of the Ethiopian coffee. But the price of that coffee is set elsewhere in Italy, or in fact in the stock exchange in Chicago, where they are trading agricultural commodities. So once we have agreed on all of those fundamentals, we can then eliminate and say what then specifically are the features that we can learn from South Korea to spur our development without necessarily having this hangover about dictatorship, this thing that can do, because there has to be clear above the clutter and agree on the fundamentals, because I do believe that there are those features of the Korean developmental states that are normative, that you can find even in the US and in many other countries.
Thank you. Jan Sang, Lusana makes a very interesting point about the way in which the impact of imperialism is very different in some sense the impact of colonialism. But one of the things that sticks out in my mind when I met your father, who was, took over from his father in the running of Canadian Farm School, is learning that essentially the whole part of the mission, when it was founded, if I'm not mistaken, was a subtle form of resistance to Japanese colonialism. It was a way to sort of below the radar, sort of grow crops that Koreans that wouldn't in fact be exported to Japan, that there was no demand for, so that would be consumed locally as much as possible to speak in Korean. There was in a sense, would you say that it's a fair point that there was a space within Japanese colonialism in which it was possible to operate and subtly build this resistance that perhaps didn't exist in South Africa? Now I know it's a pointed question because you're not a South Africa expert, but and you've only been here for one day. But
First time, 6 hours.
But I lived much of my life in Jamaica, where we have a rule that the less you know about a subject, the more dogmatically you speak on it. It served Donald Trump very well, so I'm going to stick to that one, which got me very far ahead. Well,
first of all, I have to say thank you so much for inviting me here. Currently, I'm living in northern Germany. The last 10 days, I haven't seen the sun. It's the first day to see the sun. Thank you so much. The history of Korean Farmer School started in 1931 when Korea was already Japan's regime. My grandfather went to Eastern China to organize a resistance group to fight against Japan. He went to China. And he was staying 2 months to meet some colleagues to organize the military resistance group. One day, one Chinese man, very old man, came to him and he asked, "Hey, young man, what are you doing in China?" And he said, "I want to organize a military resistance group. And we will overcome Japan." And this old man asked, he brought a big waffle with bread. A young man eat at the one bite. He asked, "How can I eat the one bite with this big in size of bread?" And this old man talked to my grandfather. "Hey young man, even this loaf of bread you can't eat with one bite. How can you eat your nation with one bite with resistance group?" He was awakened and he returned back to his community and he started one by one, step by step, small by small. And that's the beginning of Korean Farmer School in Yong'an village in Gyeonggi province. Yes, we didn't have sovereignty, we didn't have the power to overcome Japan, but in small village, he had the power to get enough food to feed local farmers, peasants. So he found the alternative of food to eat. Well, staple food in Korea is rice. Instead of rice, he tried to grow sweet potato. Nobody liked in Japan sweet potato, so he grew sweet potato and he found alternative technology to keep sweet potato fresh in 1 year under the ground. And also, in his village, we can't take back our sovereignty one time, but we can take over our sovereignty in our village. So he started to teach young children, 10 years, 11 years old, because there was no school in his village. And more and more people began to join his village. And this movement became bigger and bigger. Well, colonizer in Japan. Well, unfortunately, Japan was much crueler than your colonizers. The administration system in Japan, he used the Korean colleagues in Korea. Means they didn't dispatch all the administrators in village level. So village had still the autonomous administration system. So the village level, they could have the administration system. So this village became very autonomous. And after the liberation and Korean Civil War, it became bigger and bigger, and it came to the education school. Well, before Korean War, it was called Idle Village, but after war, it called Canaan Farmers School. Why Canaan? In the Bible, Canaan is the land of the funny out. Yeah, Korea is very barren, but we want to turn our land to be the land with honey. Yeah. So, the following his comment on developmental state. Well, we have to say the precondition of developmental state is transparency and juridical system and the law, fair law, and also social capital. In Africa, we have to think about the history of the modern history of African countries. well, it's less than 60 years, so we do not have much social capital as a nation to help each other in the community level and also national level as well. But Korea, well, I remember 1942, Korean tax revenue in 1942, 62% of tax revenue was from tobacco and alcohol. It means, well, GDP was, the production was from alcohol and tobacco. It means, well, Korean society was not very productive, and also people loved smoking and drinking. But tax revenue changed in 1960s to industrial level. Well, can I continue?
Yeah, sure.
Last week, we had a small conference in Berlin about the fourth industrial revolution. Well, nowadays it's hot word.
Yes, it is.
Everyone talks about the fourth industrial revolution. But unfortunately, nobody talks about the origin of industrial revolution. Why UK in 17th century? Why the first industrial revolution in UK and the European countries? Well, they talk about Renaissance in 13th and 14th century. Renaissance is the origin and the seed of industrial revolution because Renaissance made a culture, Renaissance made new mindset of the change. Renaissance was the seed, and the seed was germinated in the 17th century in the UK. Well, it's the same way the Korea. Well, if we take a look at the GDP per capita growth in 1960s, well, it was rapid, change. But before that, we have to think about what does make this dramatic change. And I believe the mindset change was able to make this change. According to Plato, the politics is the process of making consensus. It means people should consent to each other, and we need fundamental foundation to make a consensus between the people. And I believe the mindset changes to make the people to think in the same way.
Is it even possible, though, to contemplate, and this is for anybody in the panel to answer, is it possible to contemplate the idea of, as I said earlier, collective enterprise? Take the idea of sacrifice, which is an important part, that self-sacrifice, that you very much a part of the school your grandfather founded, and that became essential to the, if I'm not mistaken, the settlement process, was this idea that you would get the citizenry to make sacrifices for the collective good. The problem I would see anytime, just in principle with that, a country like South Africa, is it would be quite understandable if a great many people said, I will make a sacrifice for someone else's good. I mean, how can you create a model which ensures that people actually, because I think this is the thing, the fundamental egalitarian, I mean, it may be the homogeneity, although I know the EU ambassador don't think that ethnic homogeneity is essential to this kind of model, and in truth, there are multi-ethnic societies which have successfully transformed themselves and maintained a collective identity, at least until Donald Trump came along. But in a country like South Africa, which is so fragmented, so unequal, with this legacy in which wage repression of one group wasn't going into collective investment that was benefiting everyone, certainly not until very late in the day. Is how that seems to me a huge obstacle to this kind of model, or am I being too pessimistic?
Just to surely point out two points. I think it's very important to recognize that why do countries have so much problem? Not only Africa, but Europe, United States, Asia, despite technological material advances and democracy, people are very unhappy in many cases. And the reason is that I think because people have forgotten about the fundamentals. Normally, people take for granted that when you have universal values and adopt them, that things will take care of itself. But the problem is, what is the universal value? People are talking about universal political values, like democracy, freedom, human rights. But that is not true universal value. The true universal value, which is same across all the religion, history, region, is universal moral values. That is genuinely universal. There was a study done by a scholar in the United States, and studied all the philosophies and religion of all the race in entire history, and found that the keyword, what was the common theme of all those things? You know what that was? Community. Cooperation is key in every value system. So how can you not think of community or social capital and think of other things? Because those are political. And democracy itself is not a really innate in human nature. It's a system, and it's more process. But if democracy lacks the other core, which is human nature, human virtues, it doesn't work. So see what happened to Germany, Nazi. It was a democratic country, Weimar Constitution. But it brings those devastating effects if people are not grounded to the basics, basic morals like respecting the elderly, the others, protecting the female and children. And I think it's not really sacrifice when you talk about this community approach, because people see it's to their benefit if you cooperate. And if you're on your own, you'll not be able to do things, and you'll face all the problems. So it's more of not sacrificing, but looking down the road. Are you looking for immediate self-interest now? Or are you looking for more beneficial system? So I think the issue is to bring people to be aware of that situation. And so everything is social. Socrates said, man is a social animal. You know why there's so much emphasis and freedom, like neoliberalism, so much? Because people are inevitably social animals. And individualism and communal things, they go together. You see? So you cannot have one without the other, and depends on each other. So that's my answer.
Sani, I'm going to ask you, and then I'll throw the floor open to anybody who would like to ask questions. But what did you say? I mean, it does seem to me that in spite of the tremendous destruction tradition that has occurred historically in South Africa, that in many ways there is still a strong collective sense. The number of people who live in Johannesburg and have lived here for a generation, but who still travel regularly to visit their families, to visit their parents and ancestors. It seems to me there is still a basis for a collective enterprise, or at least there is some kind of collective spirit. Do you think that's true? Or do you think the society is too fragmented and we have to be thinking about a model of development that treats people as atomized individuals the way the neoliberal model says?
I think we introduced the issue of leadership because it's a significant dimension. So in all the case studies of the Asian tigers or whatever military, the scholars have been writing about leadership features quite prominently there, because leadership is able to first understanding of where society is and what is required. So Mahmoud that is actually kind of argues that what gave rise to the renaissance of Japan and Germany post-war was the fact that the Japanese and the Germans were humiliated sufficiently by the defeat at the Second World War that they took a decision that they were going to do much better and become much better societies than they were, and they were mobilized by the idea that they can't just be what Mandela in our case said, a scum of the world as it were. But it's a function of leadership. So if you read across, you see that leadership is able to make that recognition that in fact, as much as we hate each other, in South Africa, given all our experience, but we are not ready to annihilate each other. We are not ready to kill each other, and so we are actually upset, because of the history and the inequality and so on. And so we require leadership that makes that recognition. That here are the people who actually make a choice to coexist as unequal as society may be. And then you use that people volunteer. I suppose in some cases people have no other choice than to be here and to coexist. And then you use that as a basis of mobilizing people towards a common goal. And I mean, in this conversation, I urge colleagues that let's not use our recent past as a basis of making certain conclusions about what is possible for our own development. Maybe let me talk about the first 5 years between 1994 and 1995 when Mandela was president. And we then must recognize that there are things that South Africans are going on, which is that because the majority did not disown or reject the idea that was sold of building a non-racial, non-sexist, united, democratic, and prosperous South Africa. And because in the main, the majority of people agree on that, and if you look at all the indices, you'll find that we are doing well except for the last part, which is prosperity. We then require a leadership that uses that as a basis of building a new modernity that says we together must fight inequality, and there are sacrifices that must be made across the board, and as difficult as they are. And in doing so, people must know that this is for the greater good of all South Africans, including those who currently have wealth. So we are right that the issue of social compacting matters, and it's actually you can forge consensus. I mean, in Rwanda, you forge consensus because the people of Rwanda were humiliated by what happened in 1994, and they are in a never-again spirit, right? And so they give leadership the authority to do what they are doing, believing that they are doing it in the best interest of the country. And on the other hand, you can forge consensus by selling an idea that everybody buys to the extent that they are willing to give leadership time and space and authority to do what they have to do. Some are arguing that South Africa we need to suspend the constitution and so on. And I think those are just, I mean, it's true. I mean, you can deregulate, just as those who are playing in the enterprise, private enterprise, want the state to deregulate. You can also deregulate a few things where the state, is circumscribed, is overregulated, and so on. But leadership can, even under current conditions, if you sell a particular idea, that you can mobilize people around that idea. If people understand that this idea we are selling will serve the purpose of building an non-racial, non-sexist, united, democratic South Africa, people will give you their support. And that is why, I mean, the case of the ruling party, in spite of all the blunders, people have continued to vote for it. Because they think that they are pursuing this particular idea, which is about unity and prosperity. So leadership does matter, although it's not the whole story, but it matters that you've got someone who has the vision to go back, to Korea using those insights. Last time we worked with a few politicians, I've actually come to a conclusion that ideas, matter a lot. Leaders actually tend to get hooked on a particular idea, either because they read it or they saw it somewhere. So your grandfather went back because there's an idea that he got from an old man in China. Part of what needs to happen in the continent is this idea that leaders must engage with ideas and not be scared of engaging with ideas, because out of those ideas emerge the kind of possible solution to the problem they have. Because what South Africa is going through, or any other country in development is going through, another country is going through the same. So it matters that we can meet and share ideas, because we may be spending so much effort trying to solve a problem that has been solved elsewhere already.
It's an interesting point, and I have to say, as a relative newcomer to South Africa, I do agree that it's striking to say, with all that this society has been through, that people still prefer to live together than to fight. I mean, it is a striking, it is potentially quite a immense resource. Would anybody like to add anything or raise any questions for the audience as well, Ambassador?
Well, thank you so much for organizing such sessions after the methods and concept of the we were also discussing it from this side. I think I would like to probably stop that would there be also a model that combines both? If I really take the opinion for 2 weeks now, for the ambassador of Ethiopia, from my observation, when we started the Asian model by the Korean, what they call the developmental state model, it contributed to Ethiopia's double-digit growth for the last 15 years. And we were starting probably from the base, it is even lower than the 1950s, 1960s, we were reaching now. And we are now almost at a level of 1,000 US hectare. And that happened in, let's say, in 10 years. So still, using whatever number of acres, still. So we didn't have any choice because we didn't have any capital to inject as such. But South Africa has that advantage of the capital injection as well. So there are, I think, a good number of South Africans who are now well supported by the government, but at the same time, their own contribution towards the economy is probably restricted or limited, so that whatever they are looking for the government to subsidize of this so-called social security scheme, which is close to 17.5 million. That is like 1/3 of the population. So my reason of suggesting would there be a possibility of combining, because there is a group which may go further and whatever individual scheme on a capitalist model, let's say. But we could also plan for the 1/3 of the population how the developmental state model works in those locations, as rightly they were introducing this concept of village, at those locations or at those various places, so that to bring them up to the extended level. So would there be this kind of modeling as well, so that instead of one or the other, combining both models?
It's possible to do that. It's possible to do that. The developmental state that addresses where you think you'll advance it through expenditure. Then it's got limitations, because you must also deal with the income side of things. So in our case, we thought we'd be able to advance the social security system and have 70 billion plus people, but those that were supposed to be the levers through which you will address the income, side of things, which is what we have seen happen in Asian countries, which is the state-owned enterprises, didn't actually generate the income or the growth that they ought to have generated, because the state was on the one side, trying to stimulate economic activity, and they moved themselves to the expenditure side instead of generating income, which then limits your ability, because we're then spending so much money trying to give them life, when in fact they're supposed to be generating economic activity, generating income, in order for you to be able to sustain your social programs, and they themselves then become a welfare case, and they are no other new engines of growth. So it is possible to do that, depending on the quality of decisions that you make, even with the limited resources that you have. I do argue South Africa is actually a very exceptional country, including both our misses and what we have gained. We're exceptional in the sense that we spend so much time, in exile. We asked to be liberated, South Sudan and Western Sahara, and that with the total experience of living in exile in all the liberated Africa, in Europe and everywhere else where we were, and we saw the fundamentals of what made the education system work in Zimbabwe, and we saw things that didn't work anywhere else. When we then became take over the state, we were exceptional in the sense that we didn't actually replicate the best that we've seen elsewhere. And we tried to fit with the system to a point where the education outcomes are as poor as they are. And because the education outcomes are poor, then you have the number of people who rely on the social assistance program. When in fact we have against those as part of building human capital, so they become productive in the economy and they generate income. And that's economy that we have, which is different to experience in Ethiopia. But we can say the same of countries in West Africa where they couldn't leverage from the revenue from all the national to build human capital on a sustainable basis. And remember, in those countries, they don't have the similar type of social assistance program that we have. In Uganda, they have a minimum wage, which has been, I think, about $2 for the past 20 years. Any minister who tries to increase it gets fired.
That's an interesting observation. I'm just going to draw attention to it before I ask Abai to intervene. But one of the things that, South Africa is known to be, in terms of measured by the Gini coefficient, one of possibly the most unequal or the second most unequal society in the world. If Italy and Brazil were always competing for power. But that's pre-tax. Post-tax, it actually performs substantially better. And the reason for that is it has this very generous welfare system. Now the question, I'm just throwing this out, I'm not asking anybody to answer it, I'm just going to throw it out for consideration, the possibility that what perhaps we didn't do here that South Korea did was instead of focusing on the income side, focusing on the capital side, trying to bring about a reallocation of resources that increase the income generating potential of the population, whether through support of entrepreneurship or improvements in human capital and social capital that would enable them to actually move up in skill more quickly, and instead went for, I don't want to use the term quick fix, but I will, just this is the way you use the term, and sort of excuse yourself by saying I don't want to use it, but that it was a quick fix solution to address a pressing social problem, which actually didn't then, which was not conducive to development. As I say, I'm not going to ask anybody to actually, you can ponder that because I want to hear what Vincent has to say.
Yeah, just the request for some elaboration. In your presentation, you showed us that dramatic graph of growth in South Korea. What I'm interested to know was there any correlation between that massive growth and the rise or no rise inequality? Would you say Korea is an egalitarian society, and if it is not, what has been the impact of that growth?
Okay, I think I can answer that. Despite very rapid growth,
Yes.
by all indicators, Korea has been one of the most egalitarian and egalitarian distributed income nation. Of course, the gap has now widened, so there's a talk of very large disparity. But still, by international standard, we're in a very decent, position. I think the reason why that was possible because early investment in human capital, without going to welfare system. I think that was, our, blessing in disguise because the government was so poor, it did not have means to, provide welfare. There's nothing. And after the war, so maybe the adversity helped in the sense that everything was level after the war. So most of the people was on equal terms, starting from ashes. So it was easy to ask people to contribute, come together, because there was nothing to depend on. So in the 50s, when the government led campaign of empowerment of the people, there was no resources, so people had to help themselves. But I think that was very much helpful. We were fortunate because people became independent and they learned to be productive and build, whatever they can and save the money. Because no, investors or internationals were willing to give us assistance because the country with the looming war, it has no credit. Even IMF, World Bank, refused to give us anything. The USAID had reported to Washington that Korea was a hopeless country. You cannot recover in 50, 100 years. So the campaign led by government was very positively, followed by people because there's no other way out, no resources, so on. So that really helped the people to become very independent. And in the 60s, when we launched the light industry, the 70s heavy industry, they were, productive in a sense, and they came all, well off. So that is the basis for the low, income disparity. Of course, later on, now with globalization, people in the tech areas, financial centers, they get rich, as everybody does, and it grows. But relatively speaking, I think the policy of government not giving out handouts or expanding a lot, but rather focusing on production, that helped democracy in a way that raised middle class very quickly.
Jansang, I know you have some views about this, and let me ask a leading question, which is, would it be fair to say that perhaps during the phase of the miracle period of the 60s, 70s, into the 80s in Korea, that perhaps the collective enterprise, a defining element of it was the fact that there was a great deal of favor shown to the corporate oligarchs, but there was a tremendous obligation placed on them that in fact this was for, that corporate development was to benefit society. But that more recently, as we move into, say, post-Asian crisis period, that there's been some detachment in this sort of, and whereas perhaps the direction of influence would have been the bureaucracy over the corporate sector, it's now the reverse, and the corporate sector is beginning to sort of separate itself from society. There isn't the same sense, perhaps it's more individualistic society. Is that a fair characterization, or is that too pessimistic?
Very challenging question. Well, in the 60s and 70s, yes, as Dr. Wapley introduced Korean economic development, the government is selected few conglomerate and supported growth. So Samsung, Hyundai, LG, they grow very rapidly. But on the other hand, rural area, they left it behind a lot. And that's the historical background of New Village movement. New Village movement was started in rural area, and the government somehow they wanted to make development in rural area, but they didn't have the resources to assist rural area. So self-dependent development strategy in New Village movement was, has this background. And if you say individualistic culture, individualistic social and economic system nowadays, that's true. Somehow, 1990s, Korean society became 80-20 society. 20% of the population possessed 80% of poverty. 80% of the population possessed only 20% of social poverty. But after Asian economic crisis in 1998, the so-called IMF economic crisis, Korean society and economic system became re-innovated. because they began to recognize that Korean society can't be sustainable if 2080 society keep going on. So now new administration of the Korean government, they are trying to focus on 80% of the population, not 20%. And also, it's called the social enterprise. Enterprise, they're not looking for only profit, but they're looking for the social profit. So social cooperatives and social enterprise, the movement became very vital nowadays. Well, this is very tricky question if you ask, what is status of the Korean society nowadays? I can't say exactly where Korean society is, but we are going forward to make more collective community-based development. Well, this is not only for Koreans, but also all the developed countries in Europe and also US. Well, we know how neoliberal economic system can make hard to people.
Two questions.
Right, so good evening, and thanks. It's a lovely presentation. I have two questions. Oh, by the way, my name is Dr. Tsepo. Ambassador, I'm thinking about Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda with his African humanism. I'm thinking about Nyerere in Tanzania with his Ujamaa. And in the case you just said with South Africa, Ubuntu, I don't know how much that's going to take us anyway. But with these cultural, if you like, weapons that these communities or these nations adopted, do you think that there is something in that we can learn in line with what you are suggesting in terms of your book? Okay? So that's my first question. My second question to Comrade Busani. I think the professor just raised the issue of fourth industrial revolution. I'm interested to hear in your circle at government level, what are we trying to do in a way of trying to respond to most of these challenges that we're faced with the fourth industrial revolution? Thanks.
Thank you. And Bongo, you want to answer the question?
I just wanted to ask a question to the ambassador, perhaps to compare South Korea to Uganda. There's a story you told one time when we were in organization that you went to Uganda, was it in 1972? 73 as a teenager. And that your sense of Uganda at the time was that it was more developed than South Korea.
In many respects,
In
yes.
many respects, more developed. And that the choice that you made to go then as an ambassador in 2011, you expected a country probably more developed than South Korea. I mentioned this because I know the comparison has been between South Korea and South Africa, but actually I thought the instructive lessons are in that experience. Your experience in Uganda in 1973, your experience in Uganda as an ambassador in 2011. How do you explain that difference? I mean, you as a youngster get into this country called Uganda, and you think it is more developed than South Korea in some respects. And you expect a different country when you go back and you do this one. Is it 10 years?
27 years.
Yeah, 27 years. I mean, what you experience is a complete reversal from what you even saw in 1960. So I'm interested just in that explanation. How do you explain?
Just we'll take one more question and then we can wrap up the discussion.
Yes, good evening. Something just came into my mind when the professor was talking about fundamentals, like institutions, for example. Like, for example, for us to get this improved, it takes a bit longer in terms of the years, and it requires a sort of civil wars and so on, and countries, they don't need to go through it. The question is, wouldn't it be interesting, for example, if we combine, like, if we target a specific problem and we solve it from the roots, for example, local, like LED, local community development. I like the fact that your grandpa just going back to the building statistics from there. Wouldn't it be like very interesting for doing this way?
All right, so you all.
So, very quick. So, sorry for that me returning to Africa, and next, Professor, your question. So, when we first came to Africa in 1973, we did not have very, promising, prospect of Africa, because Africa was portrayed very negatively in the media. So when my father was posted to Uganda, our brothers, we were 4 brothers. We said, oh my, are we in trouble? We have to prepare for the worst. And it happened that in downtown Seoul, they showed the movie Mondo Cane. In Italian means the word of, dog. See? It showed cannibalism happening all over the world. It was a terrible movie, and also featured Africa. So we went there to see the movie just to prepare ourselves for the worst. Not to be eaten by cannibals. But when we arrived, landed in Nairobi before coming to Kampala, we were shocked and amazed. The town of Nairobi was much more advanced than Seoul. Beautiful city, you see, so much advanced. And we were shocked. Said, oh, we've been fooled, you see, by this negative stereotyping. And from there we moved to Kampala. Kampala was not that much, at the level of Nairobi, but still very much advanced. And I was a middle school student, first year in the middle school, and the books we studied with were from Cambridge, Oxford University, and we were doing lab, physics, studying physics, biology in laboratories. And my French teacher was native French, for example, way ahead of Korea, you see, way ahead. And we were so happy. So our brothers enjoyed so much, and the problem of Idi Amin Dada was not our problem, but my father's problem. But I enjoyed my life, made so many good friends, went to Murchison Falls, Victoria Lake, fishing and so on. So it was paradise. Then I went back, and when I returned in 2011, I was actually in Rome, Italy, and I saw the posting for the job. We were reopening the embassy that we closed. And I told my wife, let's go to Uganda. Uganda's paradise. If it was so good in 1973, how will it be now? I told her, and she believed me. Giving up Rome to come to Kampala. And people were saying, are you crazy? You see? And some, when I say goodbye to a diplomat, I said, what did you do wrong? It's paradise. You enjoy it. We are very optimistic. And the book, the first chapter of the book, to my disillusion, because usually we are used to rapid changes. There's a saying in Korea that even mountains and rivers change in a decade. Because we are used to rapid development, we take it for granted. Things would become much better in a very short span of time. But when I landed, and my heart was beating when the plane was about to land in Entebbe airport, you see, and I was dying, waiting to see how it looked like after all those years. It was good, but soon I came to realize something did not go right, because I saw the potholes in the road that wasn't there 40 years ago, and so many traffic jams and so on. So it made me wonder, what's the reason for this? Because even poor country like Korea, we developed very fast. And then I realized that it was not about resources or even policy or even history. There must be something else. And which conclusion I can say that it's not the structural issue, and it could be overcome. It could be overcome through the mindset change. When people have the confidence and follow the right path. And as for your question, definitely you have great tradition, which is similar in many different countries. For example, I cite the case of Rwanda, because which suffered horrible tragic events, genocide, but which made them more focused and stronger in a way, so that they come together. Countries like Botswana, where they did not lose their diamonds to British imperialists, but they were quiet. They kept quiet until they left, and afterwards they developed. But they were very exemplary because they followed their tradition of a potla, this kind of a chief system. And so I think you can blend your own tradition, but I think most important thing is to internalize development. It cannot come all of a sudden from alien system. So I think tradition can be turned into very developmental element. When you see the value, which is the social connectivity, you can call it communalism or whatever, which is good, and that can complement the modern way of life. And we cannot run away from modernity. We cannot go back. Technology, so on. Everything is Western influence. We have to accept it. Japanese accept it. China accept it. We can do that together while maintaining our dignity, our cultural identity. And good thing is South Africa is already fortunate to have realized democracy. It has an advanced sector. It's only for the most of the people in the rural areas, South Africans, black South Africans, to catch up, to narrow the gap. So it's a kind of a favorable setting in a sense. There are many countries which has not the advantages that South Africa has. I think it's important to see what you have. The glass is half full, it's not half empty. And there are many African people who envy South Africa. They would die to come here, you see. So people should be very happy in South Africa. And when you focus on what you have to make up and do it, this will be a great country. So yeah, that's the point I want to make.
Yeah, well, human capital development, matters. Country can have natural endowments, like the Middle East, because they oil, and they use the oil to build the capabilities of citizens. In the Middle East, they did better than the Dutch. When they discovered or they've deployed the resources from those natural endowments to advance the capabilities of people in the Middle East. There's partly an explanation of how they've been able to advance in the context of mobility post British imperialism in that region. Of course, in North America and Europe, they were able to make advances on the back of such things as slavery, and they benefited a lot from being able to build infrastructure and capital out of that free labor. And we know that in the countries where they have nothing, because they invest in human capital development, they turn that human capital into a natural endowment, as in the case of South Korea and Singapore, because they have nothing else other than the fact that they wanted to an expression of what freedom meant for them, and they went on to advance the capabilities of the people. Now here in South Africa, this is where the challenge is. Whether you talk about the advances in 4IR or even the basics in terms of people who still work in the factories and so on, we need to consolidate the quality of expenditure and the outcomes of human capital development. I was just checking what's in the budget currently. That's the minister says in the next medium term, 3 to 5 years, consolidated budget expenditure will total 6.3 trillion. Right? So that's how much we'll be spending. And half of that will be spent on health, education, will be spent on health and education. So you can imagine if you're spending so much on health education and on the social programs. In fact, if you have quality interventions, then the lives of South Africans will change significantly, especially if you improve the quality of outcomes in the education system. We can talk as a state and other players about 4IR and so on. We will end up becoming consumers of the products that are generated elsewhere, unless we develop the capabilities of South Africans to be able to play in that space. More so because of the deindustrialization that is taking place. I mean, the tragedy of the poor performance of our state-owned enterprises is not the fact that there's money being sunk there. The tragedy of it is taking away the ability of the country to build light, industries that provide support to those big, state-owned enterprises, because a small factory that builds bolts and nuts no longer has a supply line, because our SOEs are unable to buy from those large industries. So put aside the issue of them preparing to import ready-made trade and so on. So I think we need to invest a lot more in human capital, improve the quality. And there's a conversation I think needs to happen in South Africa. A conversation that says to those who can afford. We know that the state is not providing public quality education. In fact, maybe what needs to happen is a compact between the state and those who own capital that says we're not going to invest in private education, but we are going to invest and work with the state and international partners to change the quality of public education to the extent that in the next 10 or 15 years, we can have what has happened in Sweden, where they've decided to shut down private schools. Even in Rwanda, they're shutting down private schools because they're no longer viable. Because the kind of compacts that are there is for everybody who's got the resources, that is pushing those resources into public education system. So unless we do that, the 4IR will just be a talk until, Chomsky talks about these things in the book, Necessary Illusions. This 4IR thing might as well just be, we are manufacturing a particular content, and then there's this 4IR that is taking place, and people believe that they will benefit something, and it all remains just a bubble, an illusion, which was necessary at the time because the whole world is talking about it, but at the end of the day, the majority of South Africans will benefit nothing from it. So let's improve the quality of outcomes with all the trillions we are spending on education, including on healthcare. I think that's part of the solution that we need as South Africa.
One thing to this comment. I surveyed how many students will come back from the US when they finish their study. Well, in 1975, 700 Korean students were studying in the US. And 1993, the same number of students in Kenya studying in the US. And I surveyed how many students will come back. I found that 90% of the Korean students will come back when Korea was very poor. But 1990s, Kenya students, only 30% will come back. Yes, education is pretty important, but we have to see human capital development for what?
Okay, thank you. The ambassador's on schedule because he is a dinner, so we're going to have to wrap up. But I invite you all. We have some refreshments in our guest room here, so you're more than welcome to stay and continue the conversation among yourselves. And thank you all for coming. It's been a very enlightening discussion. I invite you all to keep in touch. The book is available.
Is it